Today we're revisiting the Space Marine troops choices and talking about which ones are taken the most in the strongest army lists. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I thought it would be fun to have another metric for looking at which Primaris troops choice is the best, and that's by taking a look at a cross-section of the top performing tournament lists and seeing which of the various Space Marine troops tends to crop up the most. You can certainly do a lot of theory crafting and math hammer between the units, but I think it's kind of helpful to know what actually tends to work in reality for people who are actually achieving well with Space Marines, talk about how they tend to be fielded in practice, and maybe discuss a little bit as to why that's the case. With that in mind, I took a look at 40k Stats Center's top performing GT lists, an excellent website that I'll link down in the video description. They collate the top 4s of each event, and looked at every single Space Marine army list since March, and counted how many times each of the various troops choices appear in that list. That way we can see which ones are getting more use out of people who are genuinely running these units successfully. It's most certainly not the only metric you could judge them by, but I think it really is quite a helpful one, as to do well at these big tournaments, it generally guarantees that your list is going to be at least fairly efficient. In any case, in this video we'll talk through the 6 Space Marine troop choices, starting with the ones that weren't in the top 4, then the ones that were, then have a few closing thoughts at the end. First up, out of the 6 Space Marine troop choices, there were basically 4 selections that came up multiple times, and then 2 that almost never came up at all. Those 2 were Tactical Marines and Heavy Intercessors, and I thought at this point we'd also talk through some of the chapter-specific options. Unfortunately, Tactical Marines just really don't seem to be well represented. Only 1 unit was used out of any of these armies, despite being the cheapest troops choice you can take at just 90 points, and also being at least reasonably good objective campers. Maybe just 5 models with a grav cannon or las cannon might make a bit more of a meaningful impact on the game, perhaps compared with some intercessors. It seems in 9th, despite being a tiny bit better for that role, it's maybe just not quite as important. Perhaps you can just adequately camp home objectives with big firepower units, cheap chaff like servitors, and sometimes you might even want some melee power on your home objectives, as the enemy is almost as likely to try and charge you off the objectives as they are to shoot you off. In any case, there doesn't seem to be a ton of love for Tactical Marines. Next we have the Heavy Intercessors. Again, just 1 selection out of the 50 odd troops choices that were present throughout these lists. Again, perhaps they fill a slightly similar role to the Tactical Marines, being really quite tough for the points, and their long range weapons do seem like they lend themselves to camping objectives. I remember at the start of 9th when people first saw the rules of these, saying how they were going to be so overpowered, but they still seem to be struggling to get themselves noticed compared with the other Space Marine troops. I do feel that the drawback might be having to overcommit to 1 troops unit. The minimum squad of Heavy Intercessors will cost you 140 points, and certainly whenever I've been theory crafting lists, it's generally quite tempting just to take the standard Intercessors instead of them, for a unit that will generally perform the same battlefield role okay, but you save a lot more points that you can invest in heavy damage dealers. I would mention for these that there'll be slightly skewed data on them. They first made an appearance in that Kill Team Pariah Nexus box, so they weren't all that easy to obtain for a while, but they still certainly don't seem to be making a big impact. Now we do have the full kit released individually. Otherwise, of course, a few chapters do have their own unique troops. Black Templar Crusader squads might well be one of the best troops choices for them. 15 points for a Space Marine body is just so much better than Tactical Marines. They are pretty efficient, and without any further investment like stratagems, for the cost they're the most durable unit out of any of the Space Marines. The Space Wolves have their Grey Hunters and Blood Claws, both of which I think are fairly well balanced against Assault Intercessors and Tactical Marines for the cost. I think the Grey Hunters are perhaps the more interesting of the 2, able to get a ranged weapon and also a chainsword on the same model for 19 points. Then for the Death Watch, the preferred kill team tends to be the Proteus kill team, the standard Firstborn one that gets the special issue ammunition, and massive flexibility with storm shields, combi weapons, power weapons and more. Obsec bikes that can act like infantry aren't a bad thing either. Finally, for the Dark Angels, perhaps the most competitive Space Marine faction at the moment, they often tend to eschew troops entirely, and instead build around their special Raven Wing and Deathwing detachments, which still refund the command points, and also give you obsec on very fast moving units like bikes, or ridiculously sturdy and dangerous units like those Deathwing Terminators. Those lists seem to very occasionally make use of some Phobos stuff, but other than that, troops seem to be pretty much entirely absent for the Dark Angels. Moving on then, let's get into the top 4 choices, starting in 4th place with the Assault Intercessors. Throughout all the lists I looked at, 7 units were taken overall. They're nice cheap 19-point bodies with access to transhuman physiology, so are quite good for scoring objectives, and those Astartes chainswords basically mean that they're the melee troops pick. pretty efficient at bullying light infantry with a flurry of strength 4 AP-1 melee attacks. Heavy bolt pistols can give them a little bit of range threat as well, and 18-inch range means that they're not entirely slanted entirely to melee, but still obviously going to be far less powerful at shooting than most other Space Marine units. Typically they tend to be taken in 5-man units without upgrades. In general, people don't seem to have been tempted enough to take Power Fists or Thunderhammers on the sergeants, or flesh out to a really big unit to make maximal advantage of that fight twice stratagem that they have. Honour the Chapter, the one that used to be codex wide, but is now only locked to these guys. I suspect it's just because generally Space Marine troops don't tend to be the most efficient damage dealers in the codex, and it seems like the prevailing logic is to take them in small 5-man units to skirmish over objectives, and then invest what points you can in really hard-hitting units like Vanguard veterans, Melter platforms, Blade Guard, and other things like that. They seem to be most commonly taken in White Scars and Blood Angels lists, not really too surprising given their melee prowess. They work very well with the White Scars getting damage to chainswords when in their assault doctrine, and I think there might be a factor of their presence being a little bit boosted, just because how easy it is to obtain the actual models. There were plenty in the Indomitors box, and they're also present in the starter sets for 40k. Might just give people a little bit more incentive to make them work. In any case, if you want some cheap troops with some reasonable melee threat, Assault Intercessors do seem like they're viable. In third place we have the Infiltrators. Throughout the list there were 10 people who took units of these guys. Basically the premier forward deployment option at 24 points. Both them and Incursors provide a ton of value to the Space Marine army, zoning out the midfield and potentially snagging objectives and doing actions nice and early. The reason to pay more of these for any of the non-Gravis troops is their 12-inch deep strike denial bubble via their Omni Scramblers, which in some games might be a bit of a waste of points, but some armies that really want to be teleporting their units or deep striking nearby, this can be a really big deal, and particularly for anyone who wants to deep strike next to objective, charge onto it, then kill your unit and take the objective. That basically just gets rid of that strategy, as you can't charge outside 12 inches. A couple of units could really ruin a deep striking army's day. Their damage output isn't stellar to be honest for the points. They do get their auto wounds on 6s with their marksman bolt carbines, but they're still going to be hits at AP 0 and damage 1. A little bit better than some of the other lightly armoured guns against really heavy targets, but not really any more efficient for the points against anything quite light. To be honest though, damage output really isn't why you take these guys. Again, like most of the troops choices, they seem to be taken most commonly in 5-man minimum units, though there's perhaps a little bit more variety with Infiltrators. A fair few people do use that Helix Adept. He is now a 10-point upgrade that allows you to basically ignore the damage of the first failed save, and that can often be really quite a powerful durability boost for the unit. If that shot was going to kill an Infiltrator outright, then it's 10 points very well spent, and he might live multiple turns to do it multiple times. A couple of people do seem to use bigger squads of these as well, perhaps to go for just a really big deep strike zone out bubble, or put some serious weight down in the midfield objectives. Infiltrators and Incursors do seem quite common across virtually every Marine army. Being able to set up in the midfield really is quite a big deal, and giving yourself the option to do that for just a few more points is often very worth it. In second place on the list, basically the same as the Infiltrators, are the Incursors. People seem to be pretty evenly balanced between the two. The Incursors got 11 selections, where the Infiltrators got 10. Where the Infiltrators are the premier forward deployment option, these guys are the cheaper version. They only cost 21 points, so fairly significantly cheaper, but they lose that big area of deep strike denial for gaining AP-1 combat attacks with their paired combat blades. Again, their range damage is kind of mediocre, essentially a bolter profile that ignores hit modifiers and cover saves, so they are really good against certain scout type units like Eldar Rangers, but nothing too much to write home about otherwise. At least they are a bit of a mixed threat, doing a little bit of range and a little bit of melee. Again, they're normally taken in 5-man units without upgrades, often just a single squad per army. I think including a single unit rarely is going to be a bad choice in a Space Marine list. You can get one unit in an optimal position to take a midfield objective, or just do some nice screening and move blocking for a really important section of your army. I would kind of see Infiltrators and Incursors as two sides of the same coin, basically doing the same great job, but they have a few of their own strengths and weaknesses each. Finally, and the winners of today's contest, we come on to the Space Marine Intercessors. Our standard issue Primaris still seem to be reigning supreme in terms of datasheet selections, as out of the list that I looked at, 13 units of these were used. For the points cost on standard troops, these guys are just about the heaviest damage dealers you can get, and at 20 points they're still decently cheap as well, so are pretty tough for the points. In particular, the auto bolt rifles do outcompete most of the other Space Marine bolt guns. They spit out their 3 bolt shots at 24-inch range without even having to stay still like standard bolters, can even advance if they need to, and they get a lot out of the tactical doctrine as well, going to AP-1 when they're there. The auto bolt rifles do seem to be the best loved variant. 10 of the 13 units took them, and they're a really common staple in White Scars lists in particular, giving you a really fast and threatening troops unit, as they can advance and shoot them normally, and they can still go on to charge after that if they need to. Otherwise, if you're playing Ultramarines, you might still look at the standard bolt rifle. Being able to move and double tap all the way out to 36-inch range with AP-1 is no bad thing either. Again, standard intercessors seem to be taken in 5-man units without any upgrades at all. There's not really that much love for the fancy melee weapons, or for the option of the Astartes grenade launcher. People often tend to take a couple of units in their list, maybe alongside a unit of infiltrators or incursors to fill out a battalion and get some threats into the midfield. Again, much like the assault intercessors, it seems that going big on the unit to maximise the rapid fire stratagem, where you double tap all the bolters, just doesn't seem quite enough to tempt people into bigger squads. It still remains a handy option though. 2 CP for another 15 auto bolt rifle shots could potentially be enough to melt one last infantry squad, and provides a much needed swing if something really needs to die, either because of doing damage or taking an objective. Overall, just on a pure datasheet point of view, it seems that our standard issue Primaris are still very hard to go wrong with, and remain a really solid choice for the Space Marine army. Just to wrap up, I would obviously say that which troop's choice is best is going to depend from chapter to chapter and army to army. For example, regular bolt rifle intercessors are going to be better in Ultramarines, as they get to move and double tap them, and assault intercessors are going to be better in melee chapters than other ones, as their melee damage will go even further. I would also say for the Phobos units as well, you could easily have counted those 2 selections together. Infiltrators and Incursors' main attribute is still both setting up in the midfield, and compared with all the ones from the standard book, the Phobos units counted for literally half of all selections. If you did decide to count them together as 2 flavours of the same thing, you could easily argue that Phobos troops are the strongest by this list. I guess it just depends on how you interpret the data. So as always, let me know what you think down in the comments below. Which of the Space Marine troops are you having the most success with at the moment? Are the Tactical Marines or the Heavy Intercessors underrated? I look forward to hearing your thoughts. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll most certainly keep the 40k videos coming, including plenty more stuff for the Space Marines. Finally, if you have been enjoying regularly, I would just like to mention one way that you can help support the channel, and that's the Auspex Tactics Patreon page, which you can find down in the video description below. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry to the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, then the link is down in the video description below. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.